one thing very interesting for an Spanish reader is the separation you describe between opinion and news. You know, the power people like Charles Metz or John Bertrand Oakes or Max Frankel had, the autonomy they had within the newsroom, is amazing for us, because this may be business as usual for an American newspaper, but in Spain or in Europe, I might say, we very often find some news splashed with opinion. Do you think that this is the secret behind the preservation of New York Times prestige? The separation between opinion and news?
The owners of the New York Times often profess to insist on a separation between editorial and news coverage. What's supposed to be news coverage is supposed to be not opinion, it's supposed to be news coverage. It's supposed to be factual, it's supposed to be objective. It's objective. That's what they preach. But what they really find today, more so than when I was a young journalist at the New York Times, which I was there from 1956 to 65 as a reporter. In those days, we had strict, the news editor, my boss, A.M. Rosenthal, was a Pulitzer Prize winner foreign correspondent, wonderful editor, wonderful writer. He insisted that we had, in our news coverage, you can't be a man of the left or a man of the right when you're covering the news. You shouldn't show that. No matter what your private feelings were about the story you're writing, it should not reflect it. It should be stay with the facts. That's not true now. Of course, it's hard for a newspaper to govern what is printed as news when what is printed as news is already subjective in the sense that who decides to publish it in the first place. In other words, you can be covering news and say, oh, it's factual, but what you're covering is the news that's factual that you want to publish. In other words, every day there might be 600 stories published in a paper. 300 of those stories might have been, some of those stories might have been rejected for publication because they didn't reflect what the dominant editor thought was appropriate for news coverage. What I'm saying is that opinion can be shown in what you do and what you do to publish. Or furthermore, what kind of headline you receive. Is it a big headline, small headline? Or the choice of a photograph. When newspapers are covering a story, they have a photograph of the person who's in the news. It might be the dominant person would be Donald Trump, for example, or his daughter or something like that. The choice of the photograph they use for that is also subjective and very opinionated, very prejudiced. They'll probably say an ugly picture of Trump and a wonderful picture of Joe Biden, or a wonderful picture of Joe Biden, and a not very nice picture of Trump's daughter. That we just find very interesting that the photo editor can be very, very subjective. He can put a flattering picture of somebody they like and a not flattering picture of somebody they dislike. So what I'm trying to say in too many words, I'm afraid, is we really can't govern human behavior, because human behavior governs newspapers. Reporters are part of the human behavior spectrum. So what reporters decide to write, and whether that gets published or not, depends on whether the publisher, the editor, says it's publishable, and to what degree is it publishable. How is it? Where is it? Front page, page 36, page 25, little picture, no picture, big headline, little headline, slanted in that way. I believe that journalism today, I only speak with authority of the New York Times. It's the only paper I read carefully every day. I do not read the Washington Post because I don't get it into my city. And I don't really read the Wall Street Journal that much. I occasionally do. And sometimes I read the tabloids. But mostly I read the New York Times. So what I'm saying is probably rambling and ambiguous, but it's very hard. It's very hard to try to be honest as a journalist, because your newspaper, while it professes to be honest and integrity and all those platitudes and all that mythology, it's really coming down to people, and people are not without prejudice. And sometimes a governing force in nature which hammers us into a certain personality, this politically correct nature that dominates the American Academy, dominates journalism, dominates book publishing. You can't publish a book that is going to offend too many people now, because the advertisers won't support it in newspapers, and the book buyers will, or the store owners will not publish a book that is contrary. If you're too much on the right, the publishers that are mostly on the left will not publish you. Sometimes if you have things to say on television. You can only say, though, on Fox, which is the right wing in the United States, that's more the conservative, MSNBC, and CNN, and the other channels will limit you. Once I used to be a guest on an MSC show, and once I said something that was not, it was sort of not favorable to Trump, it was not demonizing of Donald Trump, and I was never invited back. I didn't vote for Donald Trump. I didn't vote in the last election. I could not vote for Hillary Clinton. That's personal. I'm a registered Democrat. I did not vote for Trump, and I wouldn't vote for Trump. But I see his point of view. I came back to my boyhood when I wanted to look at a different point of view. Trump speaks to an America that's ignored by the American establishment. What I'm trying to tell you is I'm trying to talk to you as an old journalist. I'm talking to you about the misdeeds of journalism. I'm talking to you about my misgivings about what is what is supposed to be the virtue of my profession as a journalist. I'm talking to you as a man of troubled. I'm a troubled old man. I'm somewhat hopeful, though I'm dominantly disappointed. And I feel, regrettably, I feel powerless, except to talk to you in the candor that some of your audience in Madrid might not find very reasonable or rational or acceptable. So, but you're giving me the freedom to be heard, and that's all you can do, and that's all I want, the freedom to be heard and to be valued as a person who sometimes said the wrong thing with the best intention.
Curious times when a myth like you are is apologizing for being true and for having the opportunity to speak free. This is crazy. I was passing by the public library this morning, and at the very same spot that you were reading a couple of weeks ago, the Satanic Verses, there was a billboard where you can read banned books. So I have the impression that everywhere in the world, whenever a journalist starts a piece, they are concerned with much intimidation than they had before in history because of this cancel culture and the power of social media. They have to overcome certain pressure they have, even more than when they have to overcome pressure coming from big corporations or certain governments. And the scene that drives me mad is whenever in Netflix, the main executives of the company, they stood at the entrance of the company asking for the removal of Dave Chappelle's show because the guy chose the transgender topic for his jokes and his satire. Do you feel that this is the way I'm saying it? Do you feel that today the journalists have more intimidation, more pressure than they used to in the past?
I do. I don't want to refer too often to my youth, but when I was young, the banned books were usually sexual in nature. When I was, let's say 1950, when I was 22 years old, I remember, and I covered this in a book called Thy Neighbor's Wife, Ulysses was banned by Joyce, and Lady Chatterley's Lover, D.H. Lover, was banned. These were books that were considered salacious, deviantly sexual, immoral, pornographic. And in those days, there was also a movement by women feminists who were anti-feminist, women against pornography. And they considered pornography, some books by Henry Miller, or as I mentioned, D.H. Lawrence, as well as more modern writers, Norman Mailer, for example. It's not now. The new pornography is political nature, and what's political nature is also personal nature. And people who have personal views about what is and what is not acceptable when it comes with discourse or behavior is so easily dominant because there's so many ways in social media, of which I'm not a part, but I'm aware of it to a degree, that they can have an enlarged sense of their offense, a large sense of being offended that affects large numbers of people who are sometimes, whose personalities are assaulted by something having to do with the way a woman should be addressed or the way a man should behave, or how characters in fiction or nonfiction should be perceived and described. There are two varying, clashing cultural issues now that come to me late in my life, and that is the power of minority opinion. It used to be we want to defend minority opinion. We want to give the little guy a chance to be heard because the dominant forces had their own megaphones. They could be heard. They could be heard, and the little people couldn't be heard. Now the little people can be heard, and sometimes heard too often, because they have a megaphone. They have a little loudspeaker, and their voice can echo and take on a thunderous applause or thunderous impact beyond what they represent. So we have a kind of distorted sense of what is acceptable and what is correct, politically correct. Politically correct behavior harks back to a Victorian period, and our history is a Victorian nation. A Puritan culture, our first, the people who landed this country and dominated the thought of this country were Puritans. And they're still the land of the Puritans to a degree, and still hypocritical, as Puritans always are. And so right now we have conflict in how a person's behavior is going to affect that person's right to be heard, or to right to publish, or the right to be an actor, the right to be a musician. Sometimes the nationality of people is so challenged now. A Russian soprano can't sing in Peter Gelb's Opera House in New York. The New York Metropolitan Opera will not have Anna Netrebko, one of the great sopranos of all time, singing here. Tennis players, some of them couldn't be at Wimbledon because of the Russian. This is so undemocratic, but it's still our country that's supposed to be a democracy. It's supposed to be the leading light of egalitarianism around the world. Has a dim light sometimes when it comes to believing what it expresses. We preach to the world to do this and this and this and this. You know, we'll have to worry about Muslim minorities in the eastern part of China, and she should be this, it should be more open-minded, etc. And Russia is villainous. But I believe that America is very much, I said hypocritical, I repeat, it is hypocritical. And also, they're myopic when it comes to viewing our offensive behavior, our dominant personality with regarding what is righteous, what is not righteous. We are Victorian in our nature of finding sinners elsewhere, but not seeing ourselves as sinners or abusers. The power corrupts, that's the old cliche, and it surely is a lasting cliche. But in journalism, what we look to in journalism is for the wisdom that is not necessarily shared by powerful people. And therefore, journalism has to be independent. But in order to be independent, it has to pay its bills. It has to be able to pay for the cost of being a journalist, the cost of putting journalists in foreign cities, and paying for the rent, and paying for the tools of journalism that are expensive. And this is where we have to be worried about where we as a nation, my own nation, my so-called democratic nation is these days. I'm troubled. I'm not in any position to affect many other people because I don't own a newspaper. And if I did, I'm not sure I would stay in business long, because I'm sure some of my remarks are outrageous and are not popular. In fact, are contrary to what is perceived as correct behavior. I sometimes wonder if books that I published or articles that I published when I was younger would be published today.